I believe that the school choice movement is perhaps the greatest opportunity and potentially the greatest threat to Christian education in our country. Can we maintain religious freedom and the ability to truly be autonomous private schools while we accept public funds? The problem that I see a lot of times is when schools accept public funding, they sort of just assume it's this free stream of money and they don't need to pay attention to it. Public policy affects all of us, whether we're accepting public funding or not. If we stand by and watch, there's a high probability that what comes out the other end of this transformation, it could become more hostile for us as Christians. What happens if all this school choice stuff goes really bad? Like, what happens if the policy is negative, we lose our autonomy, religious freedom is threatened, the funding dries up? What happens?
Are you interested in innovation in Christian education? Did you know that there are churches who are waking up to their role in offering K-12 education? They are doing so by opening their doors to offer creative Christian learning environments, providing low-cost, simplified private school options. Many of these learning environments, such as microschools and hybrid schools, offer support to the homeschool community while offering an escape route for students who've been trapped in the public schools and want a way out. Pastors everywhere are realizing that it is time to activate their church and assume their rightful place in discipling our children in the Lord. Not just on Sunday mornings, but Monday through Friday. They are opening their doors and starting unique schools. It is wise to do so. Otherwise, what are we doing? For far too long, Christians have relied on the government to educate our children. This ought not be. We can do better, church, and I can show you how. Wise and Otherwise highlights the successful church and school partnerships. We will learn from pastors who are getting it done and school founders who are on a mission to expand the kingdom of God through K-12 education. Come on, let's enter the arena of K-12 education and redeem it for the glory of God. Hello, welcome to another episode of Wise and Otherwise. I have with me today Andrew Neumann. He is the CEO of Open Sky Education. He is also the CEO of Soaring Education Services, and he is very active in policy. He's an advocate in the Wisconsin area. So, Andrew, thank you for being on the show. You have had an integral part in growing Christian education and expanding and making it more affordable and more accessible. Welcome. Please tell us about you and your role with Open Sky.
Happy to, Dalena, and thanks for having me. And really excited about all the work that you're doing as well. It's a special time. I really strongly believe this is maybe the most opportunistic time in the history of the world to be in the work of trying to expand access to Christian education. So it's an exciting conversation. So I got involved with this back in the late 1990s when Christian education was collapsing in our country. We were seeing the cost of providing tuition-based private education skyrocket, while meanwhile a lot of American families just didn't have the money in their personal household income to be able to afford that. And a lot of churches were also really struggling financially. So we were seeing schools consolidate, close, Christian schools across the country. And really, my heart went out for how do we dramatically increase access to Christian education. And so roughly at the same time in the state of Wisconsin, in 1998, actually, the state Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional for families to utilize vouchers in Milwaukee to access private Christian education. And so that's where I entered the scene, and Open Sky Education was part of launching one of the first networks of private Christian schools that utilize vouchers to make Christian education accessible for children in Milwaukee. And so over the years, that system of schools has grown. We now serve over 3,000 children who are all qualify for free reduced lunch, primarily African-American families that are on 6 different campuses at thriving schools in Milwaukee.
That's amazing. Amazing. So these are low-income students who otherwise, do you think they would have had access to a Christian education?
Sort of significant amounts of philanthropy would be very difficult for most of them, just based on the traditional structure of tuition-based schools. There's just a lot of families, not just the families that we serve, but there's a lot of families in America that just can't afford to pay $6,000, $10,000, $15,000 per student to send their child to a private faith-based school. So funding has been a major barrier for a lot of families, and it's been really exciting in the state of Wisconsin and other places across the country to see how access to Christian education has grown as we've removed the barrier of the finances.
Yeah, and absolutely correct there. Tell me a little bit about any risk that there was involved in this. Like, did you find it a risky endeavor to be utilizing state funding?
So I tell a lot of people that I believe that the school choice movement is perhaps the greatest opportunity and potentially the greatest threat to Christian education in our country. And the hinge point as to whether or not it's going to remain an opportunity or a threat is going to have to do essentially with the public policy specific to a couple things. One is, will we be able to maintain stability in the sources of funding over time? Because as schools and as families become more and more used to, or even you could say dependent on the use of public funds, if something would happen to that funding, that could really create a threat to the schools or to the families that are utilizing that funding. But I think even more likely or potentially more dangerous, and the thing that we have to really watch for is, can we maintain religious freedom and the ability to truly be autonomous private schools while we accept public funds? And I think that's the biggest question that we really have to really watch for and actually get involved in advocacy.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear some more about your efforts in advocacy and your role in that, because it's apparent that it's a really important thing. We can't just, like when we've talked, you said we can't just utilize the funding and then step back and take a seat back and feel like everything's just going to go fine from here on out. What is it, if you're speaking to the church and the body of Christ, Christians, what's their role? What should they be doing?
Yeah, so first, I want to rewind a little bit to your last question, because I think it's important to tell the story of hope and our experience with utilizing vouchers. When in Wisconsin, it was the first time in decades that someone could use a public funding to go to a Christian school. And so there were a lot of schools in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, that were underpopulated. They had empty seats. They could have accepted more students utilizing vouchers, but they were afraid to jump in. For exactly the reason you stated. They were afraid what would happen if they accepted public funding. Is that going to have an impact to who they can hire? Can they still maintain their religious freedom and what they teach? Can they still maintain autonomy in the curriculum that they're using, right? All the things that make us who we are, our identity. Would our identity be threatened if we accepted public funds? So really part of the reason Hope actually got started in the first place was because people were nervous about jumping in, and we were a startup. We were at that time serving exactly 0 students. And we thought, instead of risking an established 100-year-old school that has a reputation and has a lot to risk,
Sure.
We were starting with 0 students. And we thought, if it turns out that all of these scary things happen, we're going to wind up closing down in a year, because that's not who we are. Really, the Christian component was so important to us. But it didn't happen. We were able to maintain the freedom of who we were hiring and the freedom of our curriculum and the freedom of our religious beliefs, and all those things were maintained. And still, we're now 20 years later, 3,000 students later. The program in Wisconsin is now over 55,000 students. I think it's over 400 schools. It's a statewide program. We've been able to maintain, through a ton of diligence and advocacy, the freedom of religion, the freedom of autonomy with our schools. There are regulations and there are things that you have to do when you accept the funds, but it hasn't threatened the core mission of our organization, which has been really, really important. And even though there is work involved with accepting funds and the audits that are involved and some of the compliance issues, it still has opened up the door for thousands of children that likely otherwise couldn't have accessed Christian education in Wisconsin anyway to do that. So we have felt that the pros outweigh the cons in a significant way. Sorry, you can go back to the question. I just want to state.
No, that's amazing. Amazing. And what about the schools that didn't at first want to participate in any or receive any state funding? Have some of them come on board now, seeing the success that you've had?
There's over 100 schools in Milwaukee alone that are now in. It took a while, but I would say the vast majority of schools, faith-based schools in Milwaukee, now participate in the voucher program. And as I mentioned, I believe there's over 400 schools now statewide in the state of Wisconsin, to the point where, and this is where the risk and opportunity, the opportunity side is over roughly half, I believe it's now over half of the students who are in private or faith-based schools in Wisconsin are utilizing a voucher to fund their education. That's the opportunity side. Without those vouchers, literally the enrollment would be about half statewide is what it is today in private and faith-based schools. Of course, the risk of that is what happens, right? If something happens to those policies. And this gets to your other question around if you're going to get engaged and if you're going to be using public funding, what would you say to the church about that? I think the first thing that I would say is any source of revenue for a private faith-based school has risk. So some schools primarily depend on tuition. The risk to that is what happens if you have a drop in enrollment, or what happens if something happens to a family's income and they can no longer afford to pay that tuition. So there's risk there. And the way that you handle that risk is you probably have some type of a tuition assistance fund to help families that maybe are struggling. You probably have an enrollment campaign that you're working on maintaining enrollment. So you're paying attention, you're intentionally spending energy on that revenue stream. A lot of schools have a significant dependency on philanthropy. Same thing. There's risk there. What happens if the donors that began funding that school gradually lose interest in funding it or can't continue to fund it? So likely you have a donor campaign, right? You're constantly working on maintaining relationships with the primary philanthropists that are supporting that school. You're probably always looking for new potential donors who can help support that school as well. The problem that I see a lot of times is when schools accept public funding, they sort of just assume it's this free stream of money and they don't need to pay attention to it. And I would say, just like your other sources of revenue, it is very, very important that you're paying attention then to the public policy and you're engaged and you're paying attention to what's happening in your state capitals, because that public policy will have significant influence on a really important revenue stream to your school. So I think the danger is, as Christians, if we just sort of stand by and hope for the best, that could be a very dangerous strategy related to the public policy and public funding.
Right. And then we also hear the argument that some schools, if they decide we're not going to accept the funding, then we're okay and we're safe and it doesn't affect us at all anyway, so we don't need to get involved. So what would you say to that?
I'd say a few things. The first thing is that public policy affects all of us, whether we're accepting public funding or not. And you could look at the number of ways that laws have changed actually to support the advancement of creative forms of Christian education. If you go back, about 30 years ago, there were many states where homeschooling was outlawed. And now we see almost every state where we are homeschooling children. And there's, probably over 5 million families that are taking advantage of that law today. So that's an example, has nothing to do with public funding, but public policy for a while was preventing that form of Christian education for many homeschool families. And now it's opened up. Same thing with microschools, and we're going to see more and more discussion around microschool and church-based learning centers, and what's the difference between a learning center and actual school, and zoning regulations. So my main point in that is that we're all affected in many ways by public policy, whether or not we accept public funding. Related to public funding, it certainly heightens your relationship with public policy. There's no doubt about that, because the funding is a result of that public policy. But as school choice grows across our country, if you're in a state that has some form of school choice, the ecosystem around you of educational options for families is dramatically changing. If a school down the road accepts public funds and you choose to opt out, there's going to be a dynamic there that is going to impact your school for sure, right? So, and even the public policy around the public funding is going to likely impact public policy around all private schools in that state. So I would just say, whether you're accepting public funding for your form of schooling or you're not, paying attention to public policy is essential, because it's affecting all of us in Christian education.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Wise and Otherwise. We'd like to ask you to take a minute and please rate and review our podcast so that others can learn more about us, and just to continue to show your support for this work that we're doing. It would mean so much. So please, if you're on Spotify or Apple or YouTube, take a minute and give us a good review. Yeah, I have always appreciated your creativity and just being like really outside of the box. Your thinking is it's just, you're able to think about big picture and strategize and really, I would say, leverage what's available. But then always having this caution and this in the back of your mind, like you're not doing it naively, or in ignorance. And it's like you're very careful and using a lot of wisdom in that. In addition to what's happening there in Wisconsin, you also have Open Sky has helped with charter schools, open many charter schools, and then they have this really creative program, an after-school program. Tell me about that side of things, because I also love just your creative thinking and other alternatives.
Yeah, so to unpack that, the driving true north for Open Sky Education is to make a full and lasting education accessible and affordable for all kids. And so trying to knock down all the barriers of location, of funding, even of educational form. How do we create the broadest set of opportunities so that the educational ecosystem that is accessible for all children can be aligned to a family's faith and their values, their learning style, and their passions. Like that's our driving true north. So when we think about what is a full and lasting education or a Christian education, we think about three pillars: faith formation, character formation, and academics. And so if you kind of break down education in that way, then the question becomes, how do we utilize all of the growing resources that are available to us to make that full and lasting education affordable for more kids? And there's a lot of states, and this is true especially when we were getting going early in the 2000s, late 1990s, there were a lot of states that had really robust charter school law, but did not have private school choice law. So there wasn't the ability to utilize public funding to create Christian schools or Christian education opportunities, but we could create public charter schools. And we saw that the taxpayers in those states said, as long as it's a public school, you're welcome to work on really high quality academics and the formation of character, but the faith formation part couldn't be done utilizing the public funds. So what we did was we created a structure where on one campus, we were launching public charter schools that were, I would say, religious neutral, but focused really strong on rigorous academics and very strong character formation. But then we created on those same campuses the opportunity that if families wanted for their children to stay after school or before school to receive the faith-based instruction, they'd be able to do that, which dramatically reduced the cost of the full and lasting education because the taxpayers are paying for the majority of the day. And then just a small portion of the day for those that opted into the faith-based portion were paid for by the families. So that was very complex to make sure we kept the appropriate separation there. And, we used the public funds for what the state would allow you to pay for. And we had private funds funding the faith-based component. But that was a structure that we created and we replicated in a couple different states.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just love the variety of models that you see. And then here we are, exploring micro schools and learning-based or church-based learning centers and hybrid schools, all the innovative models. Like this is kind of Christian education unleashed, unboxed, unleashed. It's like the sky's the limit. That's the open sky. I'm sure that's what the name, where that came from. But it's great to hear. Would you tell me a little bit, talk about the responsibility that we have again in being active in policy? I'm sorry, we already touched on that. Andrew, we're not going to go back there.
Well, I can say a little more on that, Dalena, because I think
sure.
When we zoom way out and we just look at all of U.S. education, about 56 million children in our country, and you see what's happening, there's this massive transformation happening in our country to the way education is delivered. You go back to 1990, the vast majority of children, or about 90%, were in basically district schools, right? And the other 10-ish% were essentially in some form of a private, mostly faith-based school. Since then, there has been this huge shift from what I call the mass production style of education to the mass customization form of education, where we're moving out of the industrial era and that sort of industrial form of a school into something that is far more unbundled, unleashed, or whatever word you want to use. But it gives parents the ability to personalize education, not just based on where they live, what school district am I in, or what's the closest faith-based school that aligns with my faith tradition, but you can customize it based on your faith, your values, your learning styles, your passions. So with that, the laws around our country are changing rapidly. Public policy is changing. Even things going through the Supreme Court is changing. We now see almost 30% of children that are in forms of education today that were either illegal or didn't exist pre-1990. It's a huge, that's almost 15 million children that are doing something different with their education today than was even possible back in 1990. So the point of all of this is when you're going through this size of a change to the formation of our children, 56 million kids, we as people of faith, as Christians, if we stand by and watch, there's a high probability that what comes out the other end of this transformation is not going to make it easier for us. If anything, it could become more hostile for us to try to find ways to educate our children in the most important things to us as Christians, right? Our beliefs in terms of our faith, our values. So I just think whether you're involved in private school choice policy work, whether you're involved in working with homeschool legislation, whether you're involved with whatever it may be, there are so many changes happening right now. And we as people of faith need to be vigilant to make sure that the policies that are going to shape the landscape of the future of American education are friendly to the ability for families to have religious freedom with the formation of their children through their schooling. And so I would just say, whether you're involved in actual like public funding debates or its other forms, it is really, really important for us as Christians right now to get involved as we rethink what the future of the public policy climate is going to look like for education. We can see the late 1800s, early 1900s, the country went through a similar transformation, and it led to a whole century of what became normal for schooling in America. I think we're going through a similar transformation today that we did about 120 years ago. This is our chance to really make sure that we can align education with not just academics, but also with faith and values.
Yes, let's take advantage of the opportunity, take advantage of this point in history where we're at. That's amazing. I want to give you an opportunity here before we close. I know you and your family, your wife, you and what's her name?
Carly.
Carly, sorry. You and Carly, you guys homeschool. And you've been doing that basically from the beginning with your kids. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Actually,
and she helps.
Yes.
She helps operate a co-op and things like that too. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
yep.
Great. And you have another organization, another company that you've started called Match Ed. And tell our audience what that looks like. It's really just taking advantage of all of the innovative opportunities that are out there, helping families connect with all of the options and teachers and courses and whatever it might be. So I'd love for you to share just a bit about that.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll try to unpack that quickly. I mean, high level, as I mentioned, this huge transformation happening in education. Families today have a lot more choices to make around the education of their children. So again, you go back to 1990, and it was sort of like, I live in this school district, so my children are going to this school, right? Or maybe I'm Catholic or I'm Lutheran or whatever the faith tradition is, and this is the local, school that aligns with my faith tradition. So it's kind of a binary decision. I'm either going to the local district or to a school. You had one of two choices. You would make that choice for probably their entire elementary school years. Maybe you'd make that choice one more time for high school. That would be it. Well, now enter into 2025 and we see, the American family of today and people who are, even if you're sending your children to traditional school, there's all kinds of supplementary programming that you're looking for and all the out of school experiences, summer experiences, church camps, all the things that we're doing to wrap education around a traditional school. But there's more and more families who aren't even using a traditional school. And so they're in a homeschool resource center of some type or church-based learning center, or they're homeschooling the children, or they're in a micro school. So anyway, families have a lot more decisions to make. And so as you make all these decisions, on the one hand, that's incredibly exciting because you have so many opportunities now to really customize that education around every one of your own children, right? And to align with your faith and your values. But on the other hand, it's really complicated to try to figure out what are those, curriculum decisions and what are the resources and what are those experiences that are really going to be a great fit for my kids. And so Carly and I have just found that through homeschooling for the last 15 years, there is incredible value in being able to tap the networks that we have around us. So we have a lot of friends who have homeschooled or gone to micro schools. And so we're always asking each other, what did you use? What did you use? And now that our boys are in high school and one in college, people are asking Carly, what did you use? And so there's this amazing amount of wisdom that's out there with mostly moms who have been doing this work, sometimes dads. But there's not an easy way to capture that wisdom and to make it possible for us to all learn from each other. So we're not recreating the wheel over and over again. So big picture, we've created Match Ed to try to make it a lot easier for families to learn with each other, to learn from other families who have similar children, similar schooling styles, similar faiths, similar beliefs, to help make it easier to find what are those resources that have the highest likelihood to be a great alignment and a great fit for my family and my kids. So essentially, Match Ed is a matching platform. Some people have called us like an Airbnb for education. So we have a whole set of educational vendors that have put their resources into Match Ed with a bunch of descriptors and information, and a bunch of families who are sharing what resources they've used and liked. And we make it very easy for you then to go search for the things that you're looking for.
It's so helpful. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad you're doing that. Thank you. It's just one of the services of many that you are offering here to help expand Christian education and to strengthen this movement and to build up, and support the educators, the school founders, the homeschoolers. It's amazing. And it's very much needed. And like you said, we're in this amazing, significant point in history where God is opening doors that had never been opened before. and students are able to attend a Christian school or get a Christian education in one way or another, and through various forms, lots of options. It's super exciting. I really appreciate you being on this show and taking the time. We've had multiple conversations. I've always wished, why am I not recording this right now? So to have you on the show has been really great. Thank you.
Thanks, Dalena. That's been great to be here. And maybe I'll just leave a closing thought. I'll just allow us to imagine the worst case scenario, which is what happens if all this school choice stuff goes really bad? Like, what happens if the policy is negative, we lose our autonomy, religious freedom is threatened, the funding dries up, what happens? And I guess for me, the way I look at it is, as of right now today, there are almost 1 million kids across America that are accessing mostly Christian schools because of that funding. And if 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that all dries up, I would say for me personally, I'm even more glad that we got involved now and we utilized the funding while it lasted to impact as many children we possibly can. And I just believe that God is bigger than all of this. And if that happens one day, he'll create new opportunities for us to provide access for his kids to reach him. I have confidence in that. But right now, today, this is a window that is open. There are kids that are never going to be third graders again. There's kids that are never going to be eighth graders again. Like, in this moment in time, this is a resource God has made available to us. And it's just hard for me to not think we need to find ways to leverage the literally billions of dollars that are now being flooded into the educational ecosystem to make it possible for families to align the education of their kids with their faith, and for more kids to be able to hear about Jesus every day in their schooling experience. So yes, I fully recognize it's possible 10, 20, some number of years down the road. We're going to do everything we can as advocates to not let this happen. But, what if the worst thing happens? Well, then I would say I'm even more glad that while the door was open, we leveraged every resource possible to reach every child possible for him. And I just believe God will take care of whatever that next step is down the road. And that's for him. That's his responsibility, not mine. So anyway, that's
a great perspective. Yes, I love it. Thank you again for being on the show. If our listeners want to get in touch with you or learn more about your work, how can they reach out?
Just andrew.neumann@openskyeducation.org. So just look us up.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks again, Andrew.
Thanks, Dalena.